So, hi to everyone, and welcome to the first alumni talk we are having this year. And I guess just as a matter of some admin, feel free to keep the cameras on. It's much nicer, seeing actual face and reactions here. And if you have any questions that kind of come over the span of the talk, feel free to just put them in the chat, or towards the end we'll have a slot where you're free to ask them yourself. But I'll try and slot them in earlier, if you ask them. And as far as introductions goes, I'm Emil. I'm a final year PPE student at Wharton. And well, I'll also introduce Simon. So Simon is a graduate from Wharton in history and economics. And during his time at Wharton, he worked as the student union president, and he oversaw the start of the Free Nelson Mandela tradition that actually still goes on to today. And Woodstock, which is happening today, will also end in Free Nelson Mandela. So that's the legacy.
Great.
Yeah, it's a massive event. And after Woodham, he went to LSE for industrial relations, where he got his PhD afterwards. And since then, he's worked across a wide range of influential roles in various kind of media-related contexts, such as the secretary of the BBC, the director of group industry policy at British Telecoms, and now as the vice president of public policy for APAC at Meta. So that's going to give a lot of range for different topics we can discuss. But I suggest we take more of a chronological approach and begin with Simon's time at Wharton. So, to begin, how did you come to choose specifically your course at Wharton and Wharton?
Yeah, well, actually, the specific course is quite a story, because I didn't choose history and economics originally. I chose history, those were the days when history prelims were at the end of the first term, and you had to do 2 foreign language papers. In my case, Latin and French. I think it's fair to say that I rather enjoyed myself over the time before I came to Wharton, so I was not particularly well prepared for this full-on onslaught of 8 weeks before the exams. And as a result, I actually abandoned Wharton after 5 days. I ran away. I ran away thinking I was going to spend my grant money, and those were the days when people were like grant money, on traveling around the UK and staying at youth hostels and eventually figuring out what to do with my life. Thankfully, I did come back, obviously, because otherwise I wouldn't be on this call now. And actually, when I got back, I was informed by my tutor, Cliff Davis, there's also this other course that might work better for me called History and Economics. Only a dozen people doing it across the university. Frankly, I never looked back. It meant I could drop Latin. And no offense to Latin, but I only had to do 1 foreign language paper in French and then also the tertiary exams were end of term 2. So it enabled me to have a bit of a reset. It was a real godsend in terms of my time at Wharton. It would have been, when I look back on it, what a terrible travesty it would have been to have abandoned Wharton and Oxford and that academic course so early on. And I'm thankful to the chaplain and Cliff Davis, who was my tutor, and others who persuaded me to come back, figure it out, and stick around.
Fantastic. And it sounds like Wharton was quite a supportive community back then, which it really is today as well for a lot of students, whatever the challenges they face. But I'd kind of like to hear more about what the college identity was like in the day.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting when you talk about being supported. There was banter in the day as well. So I remember, do we still have WOD-words? Is that still a thing or not?
The magazine, you mean, kind of gossipy?
Yeah.
It had its ups and downs during COVID, but it does exist.
Okay. So when WOD-words came out, I was Simon Over the Wall Milner. That was my kind of moniker. And which is fair enough. Everybody knew that I'd run away and then come back. And people were, but you're absolutely right. I did find it very supportive. Look, one of the reasons why I came to the college was because it was very welcoming for kind of northern grammar school boys, as I was. I've grown with grammar school kids. There were many other people there who'd come on particular programs associated in this case with state schools that this college was already running in those early days from the Northeast. It became some good friends of mine, and also, but part of the reason for coming was also because Wharton was well known to be, in these days we'd say progressive, then we'd say kind of left wing, and that certainly appealed to me as something that I thought I ought to be getting into as a student.
Lovely. And that kind of political engagement and progressiveness also definitely carries through till now. So what kind of political, because you've mentioned you were very engaged in the day, so what kind of political things did you get involved in here, especially as SU president?
Yeah, so look, I mean, it's going to be hard for you, Emil, and your colleagues of a similar age to kind of place yourself back into the mid 80s. I'd say, look, industrial relations was hugely a huge topic. The miners' strike was in its kind of dying days, really, I suppose, when I came to the college, but it was still very prominent in terms of left-wing politics. And then there was the printers went on strike against Eddie Shah and Murdoch, associated with the move of News International to Wapping. That was a big thing in the 80s. Where it was a big moment. There was a massive clash between labor and capital in the form of massive forms of industrial disputes, which we'll probably come back onto later. And then the other main topics I would say were AIDS. So AIDS was a major issue, major social issue. A lot of stigmatism directed against homosexual men, gay men, and that was something where part of my campaign as SU president was for safe-sex education. I managed to do, I don't quite know how this came about, some kind of deal with the condom company for everybody to get safe-sex advice and a free condom, and that was part of my so that was part of my bid. But AIDS was a big topic in the mid 80s, and then apartheid. And I'd say, and this kind of links back to Free Nelson Mandela and the Special AKA song, but apartheid was, still very much in place. And the college student body was pushing the college itself to divest, to pull investments out of Barclays in particular. So there's a lot of activity around that. So, but there was one of the only things was also a lot of stuff around anti-fascism as well. So yeah, a whole heap of causes that we as a student body engaged in that time.
That's really impressive. Just kind of out of curiosity on, how's your experience of, negotiating all of these kind of different areas of activism with the college or with the university at large? Because there's, been various periods of support and then kind of more conflict between the two.
Look, to be honest, it's a little bit foggy. I mean, we're talking a long time ago that I was in the middle of this in the mid 80s, almost 40 years ago. So, but I certainly found there was always respect from the college authorities. They wanted to hear from students. Klaus Moser, who was the warden during my time, was very engaged with students, had a long track record of public service, and we didn't always felt that we were winning, but we certainly felt we got a hearing from the college. And a lot of the issues we were campaigning on, they were not about the college. These were not in the hands of the college to do anything about them, or indeed the university authorities. They're about much bigger issues, both in the UK and elsewhere in the world that we were campaigning on. So I guess that's my take on it. We certainly weren't getting a lot of a particularly great hearing from the government of the day, and that's pretty clear.
Yeah, I think it might be a good connection point to move kind of further towards your career. And you have further academic work, a master's and a PhD in industrial relations, and you mentioned that this was kind of an early interest as well of your activism at Wadham. So kind of how did that trajectory happen for you?
Well, I mean, in some ways, actually thinking about the world now, you can understand why people might want to go study industrial relations. There's an awful lot happening in the UK, in Europe, and elsewhere in the world in terms of this kind of battle between trade unions, workers, employers, but mainly governments. This is in the UK at the moment. This is mainly public sector workers, and that was true to a much greater degree in the 80s. And this was the most intense period of industrial action that the UK had seen for a long time, and it had been extended from the 70s, right? So we had a very long period of these waves of industrial action and a real battle for who gets to control the government. So I was fascinated by that, as an economic historian, really wanting to explore that more. And then student politics and being in SU president and being part of taking part in NUS events as well made me think, okay, this is an area where I want to explore this more. I want to go deeper, and that's why I went for the industrial relations MSc at the LSE, and I absolutely loved it. I mean, very, very different from Wadham, right in the middle of London, and a very different kind of teaching environment. Obviously, much older students, a lot of mature students, all mixed in together. A lot of people with different kinds of experience. And I have to say that whereas Wadham, I'd say, was very much my political awakening, certainly a big part of my growing up once I came back and maturing. But I really, no offense to Wadham and Oxford, but I think it was the LSE which really kind of drove me academically, and because it was just a very different way of teaching. It was just so much more intense. I loved it.
Yeah. And you've kind of progressed in your career, to different contexts other than academia. So what was your reflection on that, not continuing further on that path?
Yeah, so I did a PhD at the LSE and was kind of all set for this academic life. There are two reasons why I decided to move on. One is quite a lonely life in academia. A lot of time on your own, trying to kind of solve big problems or come up with an alternative way of looking at big problems. And then also it's really poorly paid. And we were at a stage of life where we were thinking of starting a family. My wife and I just thought, I need to do something else. I need to give something else a try. And that's when I went to work for a think tank. The think tank wasn't particularly well paid, but I felt like it was give me an opportunity this was the Institute for Public Policy Research. A couple of years before the big general election in '97, with Tony Blair as leader of the Labour Party, real sense of momentum behind him. The sense there was going to be a big shift. I remember during the '80s at Wadham, the general sense of, well, Labour will never get back to power. We'll never get back to power. The Tories have just got us all sewed up, and we can never get back. And it was kind of mid '90s when there's a real recognition that Labour could come back to power, and the IPPR was the kind of almost the in-house think tank for Labour, and I thought that would be a great opportunity to get on board with that train, really. So it was great to be able to go and spend a couple of years there. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
That's fantastic. I guess quite a common question that comes up, especially in personal experience at this stage, is uncertainty about the career moves that you'll make after academics and transitioning out of that. So, I mean, I'd be interested to hear your take on that, uncertainty and fear that you're picking something wrong for you, especially early on.
Yes. So you and I talked a little bit about this ahead of the call. I do, reflecting on my life and career, there are key moments when I think you make big decisions that then really do set, their kind of crossroads or big turning points or pivots in your life. I actually don't think there were many of those in my early 20s. Whether I went to the LSE and did the Masters in Industrial Relations or, went somewhere else and did economic history, I don't think that would have made a big change for me. Even those early jobs of, doing a PhD, being a kind of a lecturer at the LSE. Again, I think that was all just building some foundations, really. I think if I'd stayed in academia for another few years, then it would be much harder to shift. So I do think there's something about, and it may be different now, I just want to be clear, it may be very different now, but I feel that there was this sense of actually in your 20s, you can play different things. And some people I know just went up and did, almost kind of not non-jobs, but just kind of maintenance jobs, just enabling them to have an income. Some people went into management consulting and earn these big bucks, and you thought, well, they're set for life, but now doing some completely different things. So I do think your 20s is a time to play. But I think as you get into, for me, getting into my later 20s, when I went to the IPPR, then the next job was the big one. And that was when I was in 97, I was almost 30. That was the big moment when I think I made this big kind of career decision, which was quite defining. And so my sense of things, for me at least, and different for different people, is you can play in your 20s and after your undergraduate years, try different things, and you don't have to kind of set a course or make decisions that you feel are going to weigh you down or restrict you in what you do next.
That's obviously very reassuring to hear. And when we were talking,
I'm telling this to my sons as well. My son is 23, who's teaching English in Argentina, having done a master's in classics. Anyway, so who knows what I end up doing.
Sounds interesting, though. When we were talking earlier, you were saying that one of these kinds of key points for you, transformed the big first job was the work as secretary of the BBC. So, how was that time for you? You said it was something you're very passionate about.
Yeah, so I didn't join the BBC to do this. I joined the BBC as just a policy person, having earned some policy credentials at the IPPR, and the BBC was just keen to hire people who knew Labour, because it was full of people who really knew how to work with the Conservative government, and clearly that's all they needed to do for 17 years, no, 18 years almost, and so they were rapidly trying to hire people that understood Labour and how to work with Labour. And that's what I joined. I think, like many people, when you first join a big organization like that, it can be pretty hard to find your feet. It took me a while to do that. But I'll cut it a long story short, but the big job was becoming secretary of the BBC, which was this role of being responsible for the governance and accountability of the BBC. I was pretty young for doing that. I was in early 30s. I started the job on the 1st of January 2000, so quite an important moment. And it was an absolute roller coaster. I just learned so much. I grew so much during that time, but also being right at the heart of what I think probably in the UK is one of the 2 or 3 most important organisations in the UK, and still is. Was incredible. So as a secretary, you get to report to the director, or you did in the time. This job doesn't exist now, just to be clear. You report to the Director General and the Chairman, and we had this guy called Greg Dyke had just been appointed as Director General. He was very, very different from what had come before, very commercial, very competitive, really wanted to upend the culture of the organization, and it was astonishing to be alongside him for 4 tumultuous years.
I suppose you're alluding a bit to this earlier, and I'm not sure if your experience allows you to answer this, but how different do you think it is working at an organization like BBC between different governments, through the transition from Conservatives to Labour? How differently does the organization work with that shift?
I don't know, because I only ever worked under a Labour government. So while I was, at the time that I worked there, was the whole time Tony Blair was in power, because I left in April 2005. You may correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure he was still in power then. So I only knew it under a Labour government. And look, the key, it's interesting when, I know it's quite a moment, it's quite an issue at the moment, right this week, with Richard Sharp resigning. But one of the issues is the political connection between the top 2 people in the BBC and the government. And there's been the tradition of always having a balance. If you have a Labour chairman, you have a conservative-leaning Director General, and that was maintained. When I first joined, we had that, and Greg Dyke and Christopher Bland. Greg Dyke was Labour, Christopher Bland was a Tory. But one of the key moments was when Christopher Bland, about 18 months into Greg's time, got the job of trying to rescue BT. And that's part of the reason I ended up at BT. But anyway, he got the job of rescuing BT. He left the BBC, and the vice chairman was a guy called Gavin Davis, who was very well known as a Labour supporter. Gavin had to go for the job because otherwise, kind of what was he there for? The government appointed him, and then you had a Labour Director General and a Labour chair. And I remember, and just going back to history, the BBC's historian, a woman called Professor Jean Seaton, said to me, Simon, there will be consequences. You need a balanced team. There will be consequences. And I kind of thought, well, yeah, probably right, Jean, but what can I do about it? I mean, the government decides who the chairman is. But she was absolutely right. And then down the line, when the Iraq War happened in 2003, the BBC reported that the government knew that the case for the war had been sexed up. There was this massive fight between the BBC and the government. And because we had these two Labour people at the top of the BBC, they felt they had to show their credentials of standing up to the government, of defending the BBC's independence. And so they just went at it so hard. There was no kind of backing off at all. And I do think it's because of, no, it's partly, not all entirely, it's partly because of their connection to Labour. And they wanted to prove they were not Tony Blair cronies. So that's a kind of an example of what happens when you get an unbalanced team at the top of the BBC, and I kind of think that's what's happened recently. Richard Sharp and Tim Davie are both Tories. It's not good. You need a balanced team.
That makes total sense. It's a really interesting dynamic as well. And I've also just realized that Jean Seaton is someone I've cited quite a lot in my thesis work. Did not realize you're someone
great.
but, you know.
yeah.
It's a small world citation as well.
Oh, really?
It is a very small world. So I'm curious then, from your perspective, have the accountability questions that the BBC should be most concerned with, have they changed over time? Because it suggests that, you know, this kind of balance of political alignment is one of the key ones that tracks over time, but have other worries changed?
I honestly don't know, Neil. Look, after I left the BBC after the Hutton inquiry, so 29th of January 2004, the Hutton report came out, completely blamed the BBC for the death of David Kelly. Greg Dyke and Gavin Davis resigned within 24 hours, and all kinds of things then ensued. I was right in the middle of it, front row seat, both the highlight and low light of my career, to be right in the middle of that, because there was a failure of governance. Things did go wrong, and I was in charge of it. So it's pretty hard for me. Eventually, I left the BBC in April 2005, about a year later. And I always felt, as I was leaving, I have to come back. I have to come back to the BBC because this is not the way it was meant to end. And I need to right some wrongs, but also I need to come back and work in the most important organization in the world. And I had that belief. And that's partly to do with, look, if you work for a big, important organization, you tend to think we are the brightest people in the world, we're the most creative people in the world, we're the smartest people in the world, and we matter. This organization matters more than any other. And I believed that then. I don't believe it now, but I did believe it then. And there was a long time afterwards where I kept very close to it. It took quite a long time to decompress, probably 6 months after leaving the BBC. And I would say it probably took 2 or 3 years before I was fully kind of out of it. And I kind of recovered my confidence in myself as a leader, as someone who could be thoughtful and figure out what to do in a tricky situation. But since then, I've kind of followed it more fleetingly, I would say, Neil. So I think Jean Seaton is much more expert in this than me, so you should definitely quote her in all of your essays rather than me with respect to the BBC, unless you want to talk about what happened in 2003. But then you can't quote it because this is probably not Child of Ours, but I don't think you can use this as part of your finals essay.
Don't worry, I've already had to submit it.
Okay.
But in this sense, it's actually quite interesting, you know, talking about perceiving that as a massively important organization in the world, and, you know, that you've actually transitioned to another organization that a lot of people would currently view that way. So I'm quite interested, how was your experience of transitioning to Facebook so early before it was established as the kind of, you know, behemoth it is today?
Yeah, so I kind of skate over the BT years. I was 6 years in BT, enabled me to just kind of recover my confidence, get back on track, get back a sense of, actually, I can stick my neck out a bit more. the issue I got involved in at BT, which got me noticed by the people at Facebook, was when we challenged the British government. And this was effectively the last piece of legislation that came out of Gordon Brown's government, called the Digital Economy Act, which was going to force ISPs, internet service providers, to essentially do the kind of protect the copyright of music companies and film companies, and actually could lead us to amazing. It seems amazing to imagine this could lead us to have to throttle people's internet connection because they were using peer-to-peer file sharing to share music or films. And we challenged that in court and say on the basis that it was not compliant with EU law, something you can't do in the UK anymore, obviously. And we won enough to stop it. And it was quite a moment for BT. I mean, BT, this very traditional kind of risk-averse organization, to say we're not going to accept this. We're not going to accept this legislation, which is done at the behest of Peter Mandelson's mates in the music industry and the film industry, which is exactly what it was. So that's what got me noticed, that I was somebody who was articulate, kind of good in media, sticking my neck out, knew the industry. But when Facebook's headhunters, or kind of not headhunters, recruiters called me, I was very unsure. I thought, don't know. We don't actually know whether this company makes any money. It's American. I'd never worked for an American headquartered company before. I was really worried about being a long way from the chief exec. I'd been used to having worked at the top of the BBC, being pretty senior in BT. I was used to being only a rung or two away from the chief exec, so I was quite worried about that. And so there was that. Then in the interviews, I was asked, and this was, how long have I been there now? 11 years, early 40s, mid 40s. And somebody did ask me, how is a guy as old as you going to cope with a company as young as this? That was one of the interview questions. I mean, completely illegal. You can't ask that question, but she still asked it. And it was a very, very young organization. I mean, the chief exec, Mark's only 38 now, so he was 25 then, or 26 then, something like that. And I was being interviewed. A lot of my colleagues were very young. It was scrappy. It was small, only 3,000 people. So I was pretty unsure. But nonetheless, there was something about it and meeting the people that I thought, yeah, let's give this a go. It's worth the risk. A bit like the BBC, it took me 6 months before I really felt kind of I could work this system. I could figure this out. Nothing was written down. I remember in the first month, my boss had to go and give evidence at the what was his name? The judge who did the media hacking inquiry, Leveson inquiry. My boss had to go and give evidence at the Leveson inquiry. So I was kind of immersed really early on in all those issues around speech online and the difference between kind of social media and mainstream media and all that kind of stuff. But it was a very different culture. So it took me a while to get into it. And there've been some ups and downs on the way. We've been through quite a few crises in our time, but thankfully throughout that time we've continued to grow. We're a very successful business. The range of issues that we get to deal with are phenomenal, and of course I've had this big life opportunity to move to Asia, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah,
that's a long answer. Sorry, Emil.
No, it's giving a lot of further questions to me, so that's fantastic. So I'm curious about how the kind of nature of work has changed for you, especially you being on the kind of public policy side of things at a company whose social role has changed quite significantly. People are becoming more and more aware of its influence on various democratic processes, etc. So quite curious, kind of what is the big picture for you over these over 10 years of the nature of your work and the change in that?
The big picture, I would say, is twofold. One, that compared with the BBC, which obviously is extremely important in the UK in terms of its influence over national life and democracy and in election times, and is somewhat influential elsewhere in the world, not as influential as it thinks it is, or is it portrayed? Sorry, somewhat influential. I'll just let's not be pejorative. Facebook, almost from day one, you realize this is completely different. It's completely different because we matter pretty much everywhere. There are a few places where we're blocked. Obviously, the big one is China, which is part of my remit. Um, and there are some places where we're not as popular as others. I mean, for instance, in Korea, Facebook and Instagram are like number 4 and 5 in the pecking order. Pretty much everywhere else, we're the most popular app, and we have been for a very long time. So just the sheer number of countries where the political class, the media, the people care about our products, care about our policies, care about how we enforce them, care about how we're regulated, how we're accountable. That is pretty phenomenal. It's the reason why we have such a massive policy team in the company. The second area that's very different is the speed with which products change. So whereas when I was at the BBC, yes, you'd get new programs would come up, and there were kind of like 40 hours of broadcasting for every hour in the day because of all local radio stations, etc. Actually, the core content of the BBC hasn't changed for a very long time, which is TV and radio programs, right? Some live, some not, and an online presence. But the core is the same. And indeed, one of the challenges for the BBC doesn't get to change that. It's very, very hard for the BBC to change. In a technology company like Facebook, and this is true of other technology companies, your products are changing all the time. And it can be very, very hard to keep up, even when you're in the company. So that also makes it incredibly hard for policymakers and regulators and media and others to care about us and want to comment on us and bring us to account to also keep up. And so I'd say that the combination of the speed of technology change and product change and the sheer number of countries where we have to, or where they want to engage with us, they want a connection with our company. That's incredibly different for these kind of companies compared with a BBC or a traditional media company.
That's very interesting. I'm also quite curious about, well, it seems like a lot of your policy background is specifically in the UK. So, how come you took on the challenge of moving plausibly to, one of the most challenging policy contexts Facebook is going to face in, APAC?
Well, it wasn't a direct shift. So when I first got there, I got the opportunity to do UK and Ireland. So I got to know Ireland, and that was great. I loved, we have our headquarters for Europe in Ireland, and I really enjoyed spending time in Dublin and engaging with the polity there. But the big shift for me was in 2014. So, and it seems hard to imagine now, but the Facebook I joined only had a policy team for Europe. Although we were EMEA, Europe, Middle East and Africa, we didn't have anybody doing policy for Middle East and Africa. And there was a moment in 2014 when my boss said, hey, look, we need to build a policy team for the Middle East and Africa. Can you do it? And I said, absolutely, I'd love to do that. So I got to hire people for Turkey, for Israel, for the Middle East, for Africa, and spend time in those places. And that was a complete eye-opener about just how to represent and engage in cultures, societies, political processes that you are starting from scratch in. So there were some funny moments along the way in terms of figuring this out. Also some amazing moments. I was the first person from the company to ever give evidence in a hearing in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, all to do with issues around violence and incitement on our services. Absolutely fascinating. Completely loved it. Just to give you a sense of it, the first 50 minutes of this hearing, the members of the committee argued with each other in Hebrew. I had no idea what was going on. And at some point, they just stopped arguing with each other and they started asking me questions. And then also in the middle of the hearing, a person who was a litigant against us, because members of the public are allowed to ask questions in the Israeli parliament. It was amazing to us, but you can register and come and ask questions. His question was, I'm going to serve papers on you. So he tried to serve papers on me in the Knesset during this hearing. So that was amazing. I absolutely loved that experience. And it meant that when kind of 2017 came around and the company was my boss's boss, so I was looking for a new head of policy for APAC, I built my credentials of running a very diverse region and, frankly, doing it well. So that's why I was given the opportunity to come to APAC.
really impressive range of policy contexts, because I also imagine a lot of the issues that are raised very much depend on the countries you operate in as well, and the current political issues there. So
Yeah.
I suppose quite a good connection to what I'm here is that social responsibility is a massive part of the identity here, and something that very regularly comes up in SU discussions, etc. There's a lot of academic work by students and staff around that. So what's your kind of take on what are the key social responsibility challenges that social media giants like Meta face currently?
Wow, that's a big question. You never warned me about that, Neil.
Sorry, we've been brought into
It's
the
all right.
kind of
No,
topic
I
here.
also said to you, you can ask me. I said you can ask me anything. Look, I'd say there are twofold. One is data. So people are sharing incredible amounts of confidential data with, not with us, but with others through our services. And it's incredibly important that we protect that data and protect that confidentiality. Just to give you an example of that, I mean, you may not, I hope this rings true. Certainly a big part of our work is figuring out, we want to make sure that people understand who they are sharing with. So when you are on Facebook, for instance, one of the features of when you post is you can see who you're sharing with. Because certainly in the early days, when I was here, there was a very big problem about people having their Facebook posting environment set to public and then complaining about, hey, everybody can see my stuff. And there was this general sense of, oh, well, the thing about Facebook is everybody can see everything you're doing all of the time. And one of the things we were educating people about was, well, no, A, you don't have to put anything on there. It's up to you as to what you put on. And B, you can control who sees it. And so that whole question of building, so part of this is building products that enable people to share in a way that they know who's seeing it. And then ensuring that that's actually what happens. So this is not easy. It involves incredible amounts of engineering. And then really thorough systems to ensure that that's indeed what happens. So if you want to share a photo just with 5 friends, you should be able to do that and be confident that you can do it. And so the whole privacy data space is enormous. And then I'd say that over the years, one of the biggest areas has been, how do you balance giving people a voice with safety? And that cuts across an enormous range of issues, particularly, I mean, often associated with child safety, but it's so much bigger than that. And where should one draw the limits of speech because of the harm that speech can cause? So we spend a lot of time focused on that. I actually don't spend much time on it. I spend most of my time actually saying to governments, look, you need to set the rules. Rather than having private sector companies set the rules, and we do, we have rules that apply all over the world. We think this is actually a role for governments, particularly liberal democracies, but they've got to be the ones that decide where the limits are. And then we will build systems in order to comply with that. But it's one of the biggest challenges of all. An example recently might be when you get a human rights atrocity, like say the recent, Myanmar is one of my countries, terrible recent history for Myanmar, and indeed long-term history of Myanmar. But after all that hope, now it's just despair. And recently there was an example of there was an attack by the armed forces, the government armed forces, on a village. Lots of people killed. People wanted to share on Facebook, so people are still able to access Facebook, wanted to share on Facebook what was happening in their village. Some of that content was extremely graphic. And so the real question marks about what do we allow in terms of people sharing graphic content of dismembered bodies as a result of state violence, when we also have people under 18 using our service. And so those are the kind of things that we have to kind of work through. And that's just kind of the stuff we've been doing for 20 years of our existence. Now there's all the stuff of AI, metaverse, etc., which creates a whole set of interesting other challenges.
Yeah, God, it is a massive can of worms talking about regulation of digital services, and we'll enter generative AI, especially towards the end of this. But in the meantime, you've mentioned this kind of, I agree entirely with the stance of it is actually the role of governments to decide the lines of this, especially, from citizens' interests, actually figure out, what their objective of having digital media is and how that fits their idea of society. But I imagine there is this concern of once different states are starting to set up different regulation, especially when it concerns data privacy, that you might end up with quite a divided service. And you mentioned that this is a concern for Facebook, is whether you can actually run this service when countries are demanding very different regulation on data, for example.
I think data is much harder than content. So content, we have built the systems to enable us to comply with different content laws in different countries. A classic example is Holocaust denial, which is illegal in certain countries, particularly in Europe, but not illegal everywhere. And indeed, it would be regarded as protected speech, for instance, in the US. And so that, we can build systems to enable us to what's called geo-block, which means that pieces of content can't be seen in certain jurisdictions. So irrespective of who's there. So if you're, in this case, a Singaporean traveling into Germany, there are content you can't see while you're in Germany, that you can see when you're in Singapore or the US or Brazil or anywhere else. So we built the technology. Lots of other companies have done this, we're not alone. And we're grappling with a lot of different content laws, finding mechanisms to be able to comply with that. Data is much, much harder. Because data is the core of how our systems work and how these products work. And one of the biggest challenges of all, and we fight hardest on this, it's our biggest of red lines, is data localization. When governments, you can kind of understand it when they say, look, the best way of protecting our citizens' data is to say, you've got to keep the data in the country. You've got to keep all Swedish people's data in the country. I'm not suggesting the Swedish government is doing this. And they can understand that. They can be sense of, well, that's the best way to protect it. We're being data centers in our country. Nobody else will have it. This will protect it. Our services don't work in a world of data localization. And also we think that massively undermines the huge benefits that come from kind of data-enabled services, of which there are enormous proliferation. So that's one of our biggest areas that we really kind of campaign on, and we really have governments understand. What is it? Why are you trying to do this? And sometimes it is a genuine kind of interest, and we want to try and protect. We want to ensure that people know what's happening to their data. Fine, let's work on that. In some cases, it's actually because the governments want to be able to access their data. They want to be able to get at people's data whenever they want it, at any time, to know what people are up to. And of course, that's the most nefarious examples, and that's why China requires all data for Chinese citizens to be held in China, so they can access the data. So we fight very hard against that, and so far, thus far, I mean, we're never going to win in China, but thus far we've managed to persuade many governments, from the Indians to the Bangladeshi government, to Vietnamese government and others, that this is not the right way to build a healthy, innovative digital economy, and to enable their citizens to access services which can bring value.
Yeah. Do you think there is any kind of prospect for, more cross-country regulation, standardization across areas, rather than, segmentation in this way to each country deciding what they require?
Look, we've already got it, right? It's called the EU. I was going to say you guys are there, but you're not anymore. So the EU does set rules for 27 countries. It takes a while to get there, but when it does, it's pretty thorough. We don't always agree with some of the laws, and I do feel that there's a bit of a tendency in the EU to reach for the rule book, because what else has the EU got other than to write rules? Whereas national governments can have a more, can have a greater mix of levers they can pull. We do see some opportunity for this. We think that the kind of G7, G20 provides some opportunity. Indeed, my boss's boss, Nick Clegg, has set out the case for that we need a Bretton Woods moment for the internet, where we write some kind of framework of rules, particularly to support the free flow of data internationally. I just think at the moment it's incredibly challenging to achieve international really big agreements on this. I mean, having said that, the OECD has done a good job in coming up with a framework around how you tax companies like ours, which we are very supportive of. So it's not impossible, but it's hard. And so we think that probably more likely is a kind of mini laterals is what they might be described, where smaller groups of countries come together and say, look, let's us try and do something here. So and Asia is a hotbed for that. Singapore is very pro those kind of things. The Japanese is, certainly among the G7 countries, is the most prominent on this front. At the moment, there's a big, they are trying to push a framework like this within the G7. So it's possible, but it's very hard, and therefore we're not waiting for that. We are mainly working with national governments as they figure out what's the right framework for them, and just hoping they can come up with things that are reasonably consistent.
That makes sense. And it's encouraging that there is kind of development towards that direction as well. One of the other kind of common concerns that comes up quite regularly, and I know we discussed this briefly yesterday, is obviously the idea of echo chambers and how easily those can develop in digital environments when each user has to filter their own content and kind of decide what they see. So, how important is that worry to Meta? What's your perspective on this?
I'm going to throw this back at you, Emil. So, because as you and I talked about yesterday, when I was a Wadham undergrad, 85 to 88, we all read The Guardian, and that was about it. There really weren't many other newspapers that would appear in the JCR. And Wadham was an echo chamber. It absolutely was an echo chamber. And I'm curious now, when we think about your time in the college, you're coming to the end of 3 years. When you think about the media kind of consumption of you and your colleagues, is it like that, or do you draw on a much wider range of media sources, and to what extent does social media, including Twitter, play a role in that?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I can say definitely on the newspaper front, the Guardian is still the go-to everywhere here. That hasn't changed. Yeah, no, it's a good point in the sense that there is much more range in kind of different sources of information, but also there is the interesting dimension where a lot of the information people get doesn't have a defined source. A lot of, it emerges on your feed, it does so quite anonymously. It's very difficult to pin to where you hear about different things from, which is obviously, quite part of a different kind of concern from democracy and, how people come to hold the information that they do in the context of digital media. But definitely, I think on the front of Wadham, a wider range of different kind of social questions have been raised recently, at least during my term as SU Pres. There was a huge amount of different topics that came across, and we, took college and university policy to entirely fresh dimensions. And I think at least partly, wider exposure to what other countries, what other universities, etc., are doing with their policy has been driving that. So there's entirely, to answer your kind of indirect question here, social media is on that front through Access helping, undermine that kind of community isolation based on news sources. But I think it still leaves open the possibility that, just as much as some people might use the opportunity to broaden their views, a lot of other people use it just to, filter it to basically what they want to see. There is always the cognitive bias to want to see exactly what you believe in. And I'm just, I guess the worry is justified on the grounds that if that is something that is not ideal, but people are prone to do, should the platform somewhat combat the ability to do so, to isolate yourself?
Yeah, now I'll answer the question. Thanks for that. I wanted to throw it back at you. So look, there are a number of things here. One, certainly is just to answer your question, yes, it's an area of concern, and it's an area that people in our company work on. And a number of different things that we do. One is to understand it and actually bring evidence to bear. I get very frustrated when I just see people say, well, of course, all social media is echo chambers. Well, actually, let's look at the evidence. The evidence doesn't bear that out entirely. One of the things that's quite striking, of course, is that Facebook is used all over the world, as is Instagram, as is WhatsApp, as is Twitter. There are massively different degrees of polarization across the world. And with countries that have exactly the same amount of usage of our products. And yes, therefore, the polarization that you particularly see in America plays out on our platforms. But it's not because of our platforms, it's because I would argue a lot of it has to do with the two-party system that they have in the US and all kinds of other things, and the mainstream media there as well, and all kinds of reasons why it's such a polarized country. But there are many countries which are not polarized. And indeed, our services are associated with a diversity of people. When I met with Imran Khan in Islamabad a couple of before the pandemic, 2019, he said to me, "I would never have got to power without your product. It enabled me to build a grassroots organization that would simply not have been possible in a world where the previously established elites and the army controlled the media. There was no other way of reaching people." So that's been transformative in terms of breaking polarization and changing societies. And then the other thing we do is we sometimes try stuff. We try stuff in our product to address this. And I'll just give you an example of the kind of things we might try. It's a few years ago now, but there was a period when what we would do is when people were kind of when people's friends would share with them a particularly polemical piece of news, so very, very slanted perspective on a news story, we then tried surfacing a couple of other stories which are very different, and just to try and give people genuinely a diversity of news sources. What we found is that people hated it and actually solidified their initial views. So it didn't help. It didn't help. So if you try and give people a kind of a more balanced news feed, they spot it immediately and they say, "What the F are you doing? I do not want news," and it does not change their views. In fact, it reinforces their original view. So they do not like us interfering. And I can understand that. Imagine, from my own newsfeed, if I suddenly started seeing a lot of stuff that just didn't accord with my worldview, I think, what are you doing? Why are you serving this stuff? So you can understand it, but it also demonstrates how hard it is to try and address the problem. And so I know we've got other questions, but so one of the things we try to do is bring transparency. So I do think one of the really important areas here is political advertising. And it's certainly the case that there's understandable concern around so-called dark advertising, where political parties can't see what their opponents are saying because their advertising is so narrowly targeted and there are just so many varieties of every single ad, you can't respond to it. And so it's one of the reasons why we kind of led the way in introducing political ads library, where every single ad, not just political, but every single ad shown on Facebook now, anybody can see what it is, or particularly around politics, and see how much was spent, who has been targeted, and who funded it. And so that just bringing some transparency to it. And in the US, there's also a process whereby in the run up to the election, we stopped all new ads, as well as a way of just ensuring there wasn't this sort of flood of dark advertising that the other side couldn't respond to. So a few days before election, no more new ads.
Those are really interesting insights, especially because as far as I've seen, the idea of kind of, they call them random dynamic nudges, which is basically what you're mentioning, randomly feeding content into people's feeds that is not based on their particular preferences to, get people involved with a range of views. It's interesting that, your experience of that has shown quite, different results to what a lot of the academic consensus on that seems to be, which is they think it's quite promising in diffusing echo chambers where they do exist.
Yeah, and it could be that that I'm quoting from some old research. There's lots of other stuff that we published. I know that, especially as the academic community here, one of the challenges is people would love us to just would love to have complete access to all our data, so you can do all the research. And we got our fingers incredibly badly burnt around this with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, whereby a researcher was given access to our platform and ran research, which ultimately embroiled us in a big scandal in which we had to pay out lots of fines for, even though really there's not a lot of evidence much hasn't really happened. But nonetheless, it's one of the reasons why we are much more kind of bolted down in terms of our approach to the availability of data for research.
That's entirely understandable. And also with us closing in on an hour, I'll ask one more question, but then it's entirely open for, questions from anyone else on the call as well, got 15 minutes after that. But I guess to conclude, I wanted to ask, especially relating to the Cambridge Analytica point, how does Meta see its role, especially, in democratic processes, and how has that changed in particular in response to kind of public events such as this?
First and foremost, we're here to try and support democracy, to enable people to exercise their democratic rights. We've done a lot of work around with electoral bodies in encouraging people to register to vote, to know how to vote, to battle misinformation around voting. We want to enable all political parties to be able to use our products in the same way. So, for instance, the teams of people that work with political parties are not gold on revenue, and they have to provide exactly the same service to every party, irrespective of how much they're spending. In elections, it's one of the changes we made in recent years. We want to ensure that we do not put our finger on the scales, that even if we might have a view about that a particular electoral outcome might be more beneficial for the company, we cannot interfere. It's not our role. We should not be involved in that. But also, frankly, we also want to recognize that a lot of people don't really want to talk about politics on our products. They don't want to talk about politics on Facebook or Instagram. It's not something that most people don't see as that's the right place. Less than 3% of people's newsfeed on Facebook involves news of any description, and so they are, it's just not a big thing. And it used to be. It was very different. And we really did see a much more political activity, but it's massively dropped off now. It's moved to Twitter and other places.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's interesting, actually. I have also seen similar things coming up, that, political discourse, it's taking its own platforms, and a lot of other things are being more specialized into, like that doesn't involve that. And there's obviously that raises certain questions of whether, the range of media that doesn't necessarily include politics, increases voter apathy in democracies and stuff. And that's a whole can of worms.
It is.
Firstly, though, does anyone have any particular questions for Simon? Yeah, go ahead, Noah.
I'm curious, coming from a non-tech background, how do you, do these deep dives to really understand a lot of the systems that you have to kind of interface with in terms of talking to government officials and stuff? Do you get to just kind of travel to different teams working on different projects and just get really parachuted into these deep dives, or how does that work?
Actually, I don't particularly know it. I used to when I wasn't kind of leading a sizable team, but there are a couple of things. One is, as one tries to keep on top, we try and keep on top of our products and what's going on in the industry, but it's hard. But when it comes to on the rare occasion that a regulator or politician wants to go deep, we bring in a colleague who is much more expert on these things. We sometimes worry when we put engineers in front of politicians, but now in the company we have a lot of very senior people who are engineers who have done this, who have appeared in Congress or in front of the EU or British parliaments or others, and I've kind of learned how to translate kind of technology speak and IT speak that works for regulators and politicians. So, but a big part of my job is being that bridge. I mean, that's how we talk about the policy team. We're the bridge between the company and the policy environment. And there's a two-way translation there. Because often as well, we find, it's less so now, but it's certainly in my early days, there's a lot of conversation with engineers where they just say, look, hey, why can't they just trust us? Can't they just trust us? We're building this amazing product. Like, we should just be able to do anything we want. Now people realize that's not how it works. There is, understand, there are guardrails, and there should be guardrails. But a big part of my job, especially from APAC, from Asia, is helping the company understand Asia, because most of the company leadership is American. Now some Brits in there as well, Nick Clegg and a guy called Alex Schultz, who leads our marketing team, a Spaniard who's our COO, but nobody from Asia. And so for just helping them understand what's different out here, including the fact that generally people like us, whereas in the US, people really don't like us. And in Europe, most people don't like us. In Asia, generally, people quite like us. They think we're a good company that's doing good stuff, and they love our products, and we get some incredibly high ratings from the public, and generally governments want to hear from us and want to collaborate. So this is a benign environment. 2/3 of the world lives in Asia, and this is the biggest kind of economic growth engine for the world. So I love it. So I don't know if that's answered your question.
Yeah, no, thanks.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Are there any other ones? Suppose that leaves you, Willem, if you have any.
Sure, I'll just throw in, it's related to kind of one of your last ones, Emil, and that's around the whole democratic, ensuring that there's no sort of dark influences being used across social media to influence campaigns. And I was referring specifically to an article in The Guardian a couple of months ago, I think now, around this Team Jorge and Tal Hanan, who operates out of Israel, and has, just these masses of the bots that go across platforms such as Facebook. I just want to find out how Facebook Meta manages or tries to keep on top of this sort of activity going on behind the scenes of influencing elections and so forth around the world.
Yeah, I mean, that's a massive area. We call it information operations. Oh my God, a massive bug just landed on my screen. That's really quite scary. So influence operations or information operations, particularly involving state actors, is a massive area of concern. The number of things we do, one is go after fake accounts. So we take down billions of fake accounts every year, because fake accounts are often the source of this kind of activity. And then we have investigators who go deep in looking at these networks, and then we disrupt them, and we report on it. So we produce a report every year, which essentially talks about all the different networks of inauthentic behavior and disruptive behavior, often kind of state actors or quasi-state actors going after activists either within their country or in other countries. A lot of Pakistan, India, and China, and kind of the rest of the world. Some kind of Turkey stuff, a lot of Russian activity, as was less so now because our servers are blocked there. So yeah, it's a big area of activity for us in disrupting all this, and then explaining it, and telling people what we've done. And sometimes, thankfully, we don't have to do this too often, letting people know that that their accounts have been attacked. And so we also do a lot of work in helping people secure their accounts, particularly activists.
That's interesting.
I just feel I need to take a photo of this bug because it's basically on your face, Emil, and I'm going to send you the photo because I've never had this happen before. I've been in Asia for 5 years. I've never had a bug kind of actually come onto my screen in the middle of a video conference. It's a whole new experience.
It's an honor that it's on mine. I was going to ask as well, related to, seeing as you obviously monitor a lot of this kind of dark activity as well as content, especially on the kind of more extreme ends. Given that I assume that Meta is exposed to a lot of kind of brewing radical sentiments very early on before they kind of are noticed in mainstream discourse, what is the company's reaction to that? How does it collaborate with different authorities in terms of, rooting that out or warning people?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One, we have a statutory responsibility as a US headquartered company to follow the State Department's list of prescribed organizations. So we have to, they are not allowed to have a presence on our platform. And there's a whole list which is public. And then we have what's called a dangerous organizations and individuals team, who have a much longer list of terrorist and criminal organizations that they have they've developed and they keep up to date, and they constantly updating, given the sheer number of these organizations and individuals around the world. And the team, part of that team is in APAC. And they use a range of different sources. So there's only one government that actually has has this where we have a statutory requirement. Everything else we do ourselves, but a lot of that we do in partnership with civil society and other companies. I think one of the, not really much kind of commented on, one of the saddest things about what's happened to Twitter over the last 12 months is that Twitter was really good at this stuff. Twitter had a really good teams of people who worked on this kind of state level actor threats, dangerous organization stuff. They've all gone. And they were really important partners for the team in Meta working on this. And it's a shame that, look, Elon Musk has got to make his own decisions, but it has consequences. And one of the challenges, therefore, why Twitter's got this big problem at the moment is they just fired all these people that were playing a very important role in trying to keep Twitter safer.
That's interesting. I suppose with the time running out, if there are any other questions, I have one more here.
Go for it, Emil.
This is a lot of pressure on Noah and William.
I know.
I have one, but I'll let Emil go. Then.
Yeah, I was just going to ask. This was something you.
Oh no, hang on a minute. This Emil, that doesn't feel fair. Noah's got a question. Yeah. You've had quite a few. I feel like we should. When I do meetings, I think share of voice really matters, and you've been very patient now. So I'm sorry, Emil. I want to cut across you. Go ahead now.
As long as Emil gets his too. I'm just curious again, like as someone who doesn't have a tech background, what your advice would be to young people, especially with generative AI, like totally upending everything. Is it to try and do internships and lean in and get into the tech space, or is it to just strike a totally different path? That's something I've personally been toying with myself.
It depends what you want to do. Look, if you want to be somebody who is at the cutting edge of Gen AI and actually creating this stuff, then you clearly got to be a technology person. But our company has a whole range of different people in it, including kind of old guys like me who've been around the block for a while. And, I'm reasonably good in technology, but certainly not as good as many of my colleagues. And that's also true of the new Gen AI companies. OpenAI, I'm sure, have got a nascent policy team. If they haven't, they're going to need to. They're also going to need lawyers. They're going to need comms people. They're going to need people who do marketing. They're going to have a whole range of different people. And so I think it's more a case of if you are, it depends. I'm not sure what not a chance. That bug is now moving. We are, I would definitely look. These companies at the moment, we're all going through a bit of retrenchment. We're cutting staff, which is unusual. The whole time I've been here, we've been growing, apart from the last few months. But we will grow again, and there'll be great waves of recruitment that come. So I still think the tech sector is a fascinating place to be, almost whatever it is you want to do in life, because there's just so many interesting issues. And ultimately, it's all about people and technology. All of these products only work if they're actually useful for people, whether that's a farmer in Indonesia or a massive conglomerate in the Netherlands. These products don't work unless they matter for people. So I think you should definitely go for the internships if they're available in tech companies. Happy to follow up, Noah. These guys have got my details if you want to. If you've got more
Cheers.
pointy questions. Go on, last one then, Emil. I need to get to my dinner. I've made a very nice chana masala that I'm looking forward to having. after this.
Excellent. And Woodstock's kicking off in the background as well. Very
Ah,
audible.
I can't hear it, so I'm jealous. It sounds like a lot of fun.
I was just going to ask, what's the broad relevance of generative AI to Meta? Because you have alluded that it could be helpful in moderation in particular, but what other sides are there to it?
It's going to be absolutely massive. I'll just give you, I mean, I could talk for hours about this, but I won't. But I'll give you one example: advertising. So, I mean, our products are supported through advertising. They are pretty much everything apart from our hardware is free to billions of people around the planet. It costs a lot of money to provide it. We're able to do that through advertising. We have, and the backbone of our advertising is small and medium-sized businesses, millions of them around the world, including hundreds of thousands in Asia. One of the challenges for them is creating great content that will actually chime with their audience and help to deliver their business outcomes. We see tremendous potential in Gen AI for actually making this even easier for them, that Gen AI can enable them to create fantastic creative content at a much lower price that can really work well for their intended target market. So that's just one example, and things that we're doing. But there are also lots of things we're doing in the integrity space, which is the safety space as well in this area, and lots of policy issues. One of the many things I love about working in this company is there's always new stuff. There's always new interesting policy issues, and AI and Gen AI in particular just make that go boom all over again. It's fantastic. Absolutely love it. It makes me feel young. Not as young as you guys, but young.
Really good to hear. So, and I guess we've come to the end of the talk. So, I mean, I'd like to take the chance just to thank you for making the time to come talk with all of us. And at least personally, it's been very interesting and encouraging as well, which is a nice thing to always hear about, careers and technology especially. So, yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, I look forward to your stellar success. Go ahead, William.
Sorry, Simon, just to say thank you on behalf of everybody here at the college for giving us your time. And Emil, I think you did a masterful job of organizing this and leading the questions. So thank you both very much. And it sounds like with your background and our warden's background, we could have a very, very interesting event here in Wadham when you're next back in Oxford.
Yeah, I'd love to do that with Robert. It'd be great.
Thanks so much. We'll take some shots from Woodstock and email them to you later on.
Yeah, I'd love to see them. I'll send you the photo of the bug on Emil's head.
It might not be a bug. It might be a drone.
It's definitely animal. Okay, great. Have a great day, you guys. Nice to talk to you
again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.